Frydenberg delivered a budget that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier when he prematurely crowed that Australia was back in black. Keeping the economy afloat through the COVID-19 pandemic instead caused the biggest budget deficit since the Second World War. Tonight, Josh Frydenberg delivers his third budget, with Australia's economy rebounding from COVID, but against an uncertain backdrop of closed borders and a slow vaccine rollout. Shortly, we'll have more on what this budget means for you, but first, here's the Treasurer.
Honourable members, the Speaker.
I have received a message from His Excellency the Governor-General recommending, in accordance with Section 56 of the Constitution, an appropriation for the purposes of Appropriation Bill No. 1, 2021-2022, and I call the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I present the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 2021-22 and the explanatory memorandum.
The Clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to appropriate money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the ordinary annual services of the government and for related purposes.
And I call the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Australia is coming back. Yeah. In the face of a once-in-a-century pandemic, the Australian spirit has shone through. Doctors and nurses on the front line, teachers and students in the virtual classroom, businesses big and small, keeping the economy moving. Team Australia at its best, a nation to be proud of. Yeah. Mr Speaker, we have come so far since the height of the pandemic. Treasury feared unemployment could reach 15% and the economy could contract by more than 20%. This would have meant more than 2 million Australians unemployed. It would have been the equivalent of losing the agriculture, construction and mining sectors. But, Mr Speaker, today the reality is very different. Ahead of any major advanced economy, Australia has seen employment go above its pre-pandemic levels. Yeah. At 5.6%, unemployment today is lower than when we came to government. This is remarkable because Australia's fate could have been so much worse. The United Kingdom, France and Italy have all contracted by more than 8%. Japan and Canada by around 5%. Australia just 2.5%. On the health front, the catastrophic loss of life seen elsewhere has been averted. Early and decisive action saved lives and livelihoods. We closed our borders, the Prime Minister established the National Cabinet, and unprecedented support is seeing the country through the biggest global economic shock since the Great Depression. JobKeeper kept 3.8 million people in their job. Yeah. JobSeeker helped 1.5 million people without work. And the cash flow boost supported 800,000 businesses and not-for-profits. And additional payments went to millions of pensioners, carers, veterans and others on income support. All made possible because we entered this crisis from a position of economic strength. But, Mr Speaker, it has come at a significant and unavoidable cost. The COVID-19 recession will see our deficit reach $161 billion this year, falling to $57 billion in 2024-25. With more Australians back at work, this year's deficit is $52.7 billion lower than it was expected just over 6 months ago in last year's budget. Net debt will increase to $617.5 billion, or 30% of GDP this year, and peak at $980.6 billion, or 40.9% of GDP in June 2025. This is low by international standards. As a share of the economy, net debt is around half of that in the United Kingdom and the United States, and less than a third of that in Japan. We are better placed than nearly any other country in the world to meet the economic challenges that lie ahead. Consumer sentiment is at its highest in 11 years. Business conditions reached record highs, and more Australians are in work than ever before. Our plan is working. Australia's economic engine is roaring back to life. Since the last budget, almost 500,000 jobs have been created. Tonight, I outline the Morrison government's plan to secure Australia's economic recovery and build for the future. A plan that continues to protect Australians from COVID. A plan that creates more jobs. A plan that guarantees the essential services. And a plan that builds a more resilient and secure Australia. It is a plan that is guided by our enduring values. Reward for effort, the power of persuasion and aspiration and enterprise, upholding personal responsibility, and always providing a helping hand to those who need it. This is what the Coalition stands for. Mr. Speaker, our first priority is to keep Australians safe from COVID. In this budget, a further $1.9 billion is allocated for the rollout of vaccines. Australians have already received over 2.5 million doses. This budget provides another $1.5 billion for COVID-related health services, including for testing and tracing, respiratory clinics and telehealth. In total, the Morrison government has committed $20 billion to the vaccine rollout and to strengthen our health system in the face of COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, Australia's economic recovery is now well underway, and we must keep the momentum going. In last year's budget, we promised hard-working Australians tax cuts, and we delivered. We promised the largest set of investment incentives, and we delivered. We promised more jobs, and we delivered. And this was done without undermining the structural integrity of the budget. But, Mr. Speaker, this pandemic is not over, and for as long as the virus persists, so will we. So tonight, we go further, announcing that over 10 million low and middle income earners will benefit from a new and additional tax cut. A stimulus measure that will support the recovery and build on tax cuts that we announced in last year's budget and budgets before that. Low and middle income earners will receive up to $1,080 for individuals or $2,160 for couples. More of their money in their pockets to spend across the economy, creating jobs. Under the Coalition, taxes will always be lower and hard-working Australian families will always be better off. Mr. Speaker, 8 out of 10 jobs are in the private sector. A sustainable recovery requires a strong private sector. Our record investment incentives are filling the order books of the nation. Over 99% of businesses employing over 11 million workers can write off the full value of any eligible asset that they purchase. This has seen their spending on machinery and equipment increase at the fastest rate in nearly 7 years. So tonight, we again go further, announcing the extension of these measures for a further year until the 30th of June 2023, so a tradie can buy a new ute, a farmer a new harvester and a manufacturer expand their production line. Mr Speaker, when construction work began to dry up, HomeBuilder came to the rescue. New house starts are now at their highest level in 20 years. New loans to first home buyers reached their highest level in nearly 12 years. HomeBuilder has been a huge success. And our $2 billion investment in affordable housing is bringing on more supply. Mr Speaker, in this budget, our housing measures go even further, helping another 10,000 first home buyers build a new home with a 5% deposit, supporting 10,000 single parents to purchase a home with as low as a 2% deposit, increasing the amount that can be released under the First Home Super Saver scheme from $30,000 to $50,000. Mr Speaker, under the Coalition, home ownership will always be supported. Mr Speaker, we know that some sectors and regions across the country continue to do it tough. That is why this budget provides a further $2.1 billion in targeted support for aviation, tourism, the arts and international education providers. More than 800,000 half-price airfares, support for more than 200 productions, grants to English language course providers and extending our small business loan scheme, which has already helped more than 45,000 businesses access low-cost finance. And we're also providing tax relief for around 1,000 small brewers and distillers across the nation. Mr Speaker, small and family businesses are the engine room of our economy. They are at the heart of every local community. As they strive to recover, we need the tax system to work for them, not against them. So tonight we provide small business with peace of mind that an independent umpire will stand between them and the tax office when it comes to debt recovery actions. We will take these disputes out of the courts and let small business get on with what they do best. Under the Coalition, small business will always be stronger. Mr Speaker, we need to equip Australians with the skills that they need to get a job today and tomorrow. In this budget, we double our commitment to the Job Trainer Fund, supporting a total of more than 450,000 new training places to upskill job seekers and young people. At a cost of $2.7 billion, we will create 170,000 new apprenticeships and traineeships. Building on the 100,000 new apprentices we have already helped into a job in the first stage of the program. We will help more women break into non-traditional trades with training support for 5,000 places. And will provide 2,700 places in Indigenous girls' academies to help them finish school and enter the workforce. And more STEM scholarships for women in partnership with industry. Tonight, we are also providing another 5,000 places in higher education short courses and better matching job seekers to jobs. We will invest in modernising employment services, including specialist assistance for young and Indigenous Australians. Importantly, for those who find themselves without work, the government has strengthened the safety net, increasing the job seeker payment while enhancing mutual obligations. Mr. Speaker, childcare is an important driver of higher workforce participation and women's economic security. In this budget, we are making a further and targeted $1.7 billion investment in childcare. This will increase the affordability of childcare for low and middle income families. 250,000 families will be better off by an average of $2,200 a year, giving more parents, especially women, the choice to take on extra work. Mr. Speaker, our economic plan capitalises on the opportunities that will exist on the other side of this crisis. Building the infrastructure our economy needs for the future with our 10-year, $110 billion infrastructure program. Tonight we make $15 billion in additional infrastructure commitments, including for the North-South Corridor in South Australia, the Great Western Highway and Newcastle Airport in New South Wales, the new Melbourne Intermodal Terminal in Victoria, the Bruce Highway in Queensland, MetroNet in Western Australia, highway upgrades in the Northern Territory, Light Rail Stage 2A in the Australian Capital Territory and Midland Highway upgrades in Tasmania. In this budget, we also invest a further $1 billion in road safety upgrades to save lives and a further $1 billion in local road infrastructure projects. Funding for these shovel-ready projects will be provided on a use-it-or-lose-it basis. And through the Building Better Regions Fund, we will support a further $250 million of regional community infrastructure projects, creating more jobs. Mr. Speaker, under the Coalition, regional Australia will never be taken for granted. Throughout the pandemic, we have seen how quickly Australians have adopted, changing the way we work, shop and communicate, a trend that will only accelerate. Digital infrastructure and digital skills will be critical for the competitiveness of our economy, creating massive opportunities for growth and jobs. In this budget, we are investing $1.2 billion in our digital economy strategy, establishing a new national network of artificial intelligence centres to drive business adoption of these new technologies, expanding our Cyber Security Innovation Fund to train the next generation of cyber security experts, and undertaking a digital skills cadetship trial which combines workplace and vocational training. Mr. Speaker, Australia's manufacturing sector will be a key driver of future jobs and higher wages. That is why we have already committed $1.5 billion to expand manufacturing activity and create jobs across 6 priority areas, including medical products and clean energy. We backed in our modern manufacturing strategy with an additional $2 billion in research and development incentives. Australia has led the world with innovations like Wi-Fi, the bionic ear and a vaccine for cervical cancer. And we want to see more innovation commercialised in Australia. And so tonight, we are launching a new patent box starting on the 1st of July next year. Under the patent box, income earned from new patents that have been developed in Australia will be taxed at a concessional 17% rate, almost half the rate that applies to large companies. The patent box will apply to the medical and biotech sectors, and we will consult on expanding it to the clean energy sector. Mr. Speaker, Australia's effective management of COVID makes us an even more attractive place for the best and the brightest from around the world. To take advantage of this, we are streamlining visas to target highly skilled individuals when circumstances allow. We're simplifying our tax laws, including the treatment of employee share ownership schemes in line with the rest of the world. And we're improving Australia's competitiveness as a financial services sector and centre in the region. Mr. Speaker, our strong economy enables us to guarantee the essential services that Australians rely on. In this budget, the Morrison government is providing record funding for schools, for hospitals, Medicare, mental health, aged care and disability support. Since coming to government, we have listed more than 2,600 medicines on the PBS, an average of one each and every day. This has put life-changing treatments within the reach of every Australian. In this budget, we fund new medicines to treat breast cancer, lung cancer, asthma and osteoporosis. Tonight, we announced the listing of Emgality to treat chronic migraines. Instead of costing $6,800 per year for treatment, it will now cost just $41.30 a script or $6.60 for concession card holders. The government is also providing in this budget new funding for endometriosis, research into preterm birth and genetic testing for pregnant women. Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to ensuring Australians can access quality medical services no matter where they live. That is why in this budget we will provide higher incentives to rural and regional GPs for bulk billed services, helping to keep more doctors in the regions. Mr. Speaker, the NDIS has made Australia a better country, profoundly improving the lives of people with a disability and their families. A new wheelchair, home modifications, care in the home and transport to work. Today, 450,000 people are receiving disability support. In the last year alone, more than 100,000 people have joined the scheme. In this budget, we will spend a further $13.2 billion over 4 years to meet the needs of Australians with a disability. And as the scheme reaches maturity, our focus is on ensuring its sustainability and that it continues to deliver a high-quality, essential service for those who need it. Under the Coalition, the NDIS will always be fully funded. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister called the Royal Commission into aged care, quality and safety. It revealed shocking cases of neglect and abuse. Tonight, we commit $17.7 billion in targeted and practical new funding to significantly improve the system. We will fund another 80,000 new home care packages, bringing the total to 275,000 home care packages that will be available. We will increase the time nurses and carers are required to spend with residents. We will make an additional payment of $10 per resident per day to enhance the viability and sustainability of the residential aged care system. We will support over 33,000 new training places for personal carers and a new Indigenous workforce. We will provide retention bonuses to keep more nurses in aged care. We will increase the respite services for carers, and we will strengthen the regulatory regime to monitor and enforce standards of care. We will upgrade essential aged care infrastructure in regional and remote areas around the country. Mr. Speaker, this package brings our record investment in aged care to over $119 billion over the next 4 years. We are committed to restoring trust in the system and allowing Australians to age with dignity and respect. Mr. Speaker, everybody listening tonight knows somebody who is struggling with their mental health. Suicide is the leading cause of death in Australia for those aged 18 to 44. Tragically, over 65,000 of our fellow Australians attempt to take their own life each year. These are not just statistics on a page. These are our family, these are our friends, these are our colleagues. In every budget, we have committed more resources to frontline services. Beyond Blue, Lifeline, Kids Helpline. Tonight, we extend our support with a $2.3 billion commitment to mental health and suicide prevention. More Headspace centres to support more young Australians. Expanding this model to those aged over 25 with a new Head to Health national network of 40 centres. Increased funding for the treatment of people with eating disorders. Greater access to psychiatrists, psychologists and GPs through Medicare. Universal care and access for people who have been discharged from hospital following a suicide attempt. A new National Suicide Prevention Office. And as the Prime Minister has announced, we will establish a Royal Commission into defence and veterans' suicide. Mr. Speaker, we have nearly doubled spending on mental health since we came to government. It is a clear national priority. It goes to the heart of who we are as Australians, helping those who need it most. Mr. Speaker, in this budget, the government is investing record funding in education. We've already doubled school funding since we came to office. Our focus is on lifting student outcomes and better equipping teachers. Mr. Speaker, tonight we also commit $2 billion to fund preschools with reforms to improve participation. Preschool is a vital time in a child's development and prepares them for the educational journey ahead. In this budget, we're also providing more than $19 billion in funding for our universities in 2021-22. And as a result of decisions made during this pandemic, this year there are 30,000 more places at Australian universities. Mr. Speaker, all Australians have the right to be safe. The reality is that for too many women, this is not their experience. 1 in 4 women experience violence from a current or a former partner. This must stop, and we must do all we can to end all forms of violence against women and children. Since we came to government, we have invested more than $1 billion to keep women and children safe. And tonight we invest a further $1.1 billion in women's safety, delivering more emergency accommodation, more legal assistance, more counselling, more financial support, including cash payments for those escaping abusive relationships, more targeted services for Indigenous, migrant and refugee women and women with a disability. We will improve the family law system to better protect children, give victims of domestic violence greater access to justice and reduce the time spent in court. Mr. Speaker, sexual harassment is unacceptable in any context. When it occurs in the workplace, it denies women their dignity as well as their personal and economic security. The government, in its response to the Respect at Work report, is strengthening laws, guidance and standards to prevent and to address harassment. Mr. Speaker, we want all Australians to get the most out of the superannuation system. On average, women retire with less superannuation than men. So tonight, the government will remove the current $450 per month minimum income threshold for the superannuation guarantee. This will improve economic security in retirement for around 200,000 women. Our plan will also make it easier for Australians to prepare for retirement and to be more secure once in retirement. We will improve flexibility by no longer requiring older Australians to meet a work test before they can make voluntary contributions to superannuation. We will allow those aged over 60 to contribute up to $300,000 into their superannuation if they downsize their home, freeing up more housing stock for younger families. And we will also enhance the pension loan scheme by providing immediate access to lump sums of around $12,000 for singles and $18,000 for couples. Under the Coalition, Australian seniors will always have more control over their money. Mr. Speaker, COVID has not been the only challenge Australia has faced. Droughts, bushfires, cyclones and flood. This budget provides more resources to help Australians prepare, respond and recover from these natural disasters. A new National Recovery and Resilience Agency to lead our response to natural disasters. A $10 billion government guarantee to make insurance more affordable in Northern Australia. Funding from our $3.5 billion National Water Grid Fund to make regional Australia more resilient to drought, building dams and irrigation projects. More than $600 million for community and household projects to mitigate the impact of natural disasters. And $170 million to strengthen internet and mobile coverage in regional Australia, particularly in bushfire-prone areas. Mr. Speaker, Australia's biosecurity system protects more than $50 billion in agricultural exports and 1.6 million jobs from threats like African swine fever. This budget will strengthen border screening controls and improve our ability to fight an outbreak. Mr. Speaker, a resilient Australia requires diverse and reliable supply chains. That is why we are providing additional support for Australian manufacturers of critical products and more funding to help small businesses and farmers expand and diversify their export markets. Mr. Speaker, our industries and our regions depend on affordable and reliable energy. That's why the government is unlocking vast gas reserves in the North Bowen and Galilee basins and investing in hydrogen-ready gas plants. We're also shoring up our fuel security by helping local refineries to keep operating here in Australia. Mr. Speaker, we are the custodians of this great continent for future generations. This budget provides over $480 million in new funding for the environment, including $100 million to protect our oceans. We're also upgrading our recycling capabilities, creating jobs and reducing waste sent to landfill. Australia is playing its part on climate change too, having met our 2020 commitments and on track to meet and beat our 2030 target. Australia is on the pathway to net zero, and our goal is to get there as soon as we possibly can, preferably by 2050. We will do this with a practical, technology-focused approach. Technology, not taxes, Mr. Speaker. Already we have the highest uptake of rooftop solar in the world and are supporting major energy projects like Snowy 2.0 and Battery of the Nation. And in this budget we are investing a further $1.6 billion to fund priority technologies, including clean hydrogen and energy storage. Our approach will strengthen the economy, create more jobs and reduce emissions. Mr. Speaker, while we have been fighting COVID, other threats to our national security have not gone away. To keep Australians safe from these threats, whether domestic or foreign, the government is providing an additional $1.9 billion over the decade to strengthen our national security, law enforcement and intelligence agencies. We also need to be prepared for a world that is less stable and more contested. That is why we are investing $270 billion over 10 years in Australia's defence capability. The Australian Defence Force continues to protect and uphold our national interests abroad and at home. Our Defence Force are always there for us and we are forever indebted to them. Mr. Speaker, this pandemic is far from over. Around the world, there are more than 800,000 new COVID cases every day. The global economic environment remains uncertain. The euro area has fallen back into recession, but Australia is now well on the road to recovery. Our economy is forecast to grow by 1.25% in 2021, rising to 4.25% in 2021-22. Employment is at a record high, with 75,000 Australians in jobs more than they were before the pandemic. And this budget will help create more than 250,000 more jobs by the end of 2022-23. Mr. Speaker, this budget secures the recovery and sets Australia up for the future. Tax cuts to put more money into people's pockets. Business incentives to unleash a further wave of investment. New apprenticeships and training places to get more Australians into work. A $110 billion infrastructure pipeline to build our nation's future. And record funding to guarantee the essential services Australians rely on. Mr. Speaker, the jobs are coming back, the economy is coming back, Australia is coming back, and this budget will ensure we come back even stronger and ensure that we secure Australia's economic recovery. I commend the budget to the House.
Hello again. Tonight's budget confirms that the Australian economy is bouncing back strongly. Growth is predicted to hit more than 4% next year. Unemployment's forecast to fall to below 5%, while this year's deficit of $160 billion is a $50 billion improvement on last year's prediction. There's plenty of new spending on aged care, childcare, mental health, new apprenticeships and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. But the somewhat rosy picture is based on heroic assumptions, including full national vaccination by the end of the year, when the vaccine rollout so far has been anything but world-beating. I'll be joined shortly by the Treasurer live from Parliament House for his first post-budget interview. But first, here's James Glenday with the budget's key measures and what they could mean for you.
A Treasurer who once vowed to get the nation back in black, tonight delivered his second pandemic budget with no pathway to a surplus. The headline figures in these books can be summed up in a simple way. Things are, of course, much worse than expected before COVID-19 hit, but much better than last year when Australia looked to be on the edge of an economic abyss. Make no mistake, the deficits are still eye-watering. $161 billion this year, $106 billion next. By mid-2025, we'll still be $57 billion in the red. However, this year, we're already almost $53 billion better off than originally forecast. That's thanks largely to the economy, which is recovering rapidly from a virus-induced recession. It's predicted to keep growing over the next 4 years. Containing COVID here is key. It's given families the confidence to spend more, boosting GST take. More people are in jobs, so income tax receipts are up and the welfare bill is lower, while company tax is better than expected too, partly because despite the tensions with Beijing, the Chinese are pushing up global demand for iron ore and the spot price is about 4 times higher than initially forecast.
In this budget, there's a great and real focus on creating jobs.
Josh Frydenberg's main message tonight, though, is that it's too early for austerity. The government wants to keep on spending to drive down unemployment to 4.75% in 2 years' time.
We have a historic opportunity to take unemployment from 5.6% today to where it began at the start of this crisis, and even lower.
Budgets are always a window into a government's policy priorities, and as expected, tonight the centrepiece is an extra $17.7 billion over 5 years for aged care. The extra cash will help address the abuse, neglect and underfunding exposed by the recent Royal Commission. It's less money than what some advocates wanted, but it will deliver 80,000 new home care packages, nearly 34,000 training places to boost the workforce, while providers will be required by 2023 to provide an average of 200 minutes of care a day per resident.
Get around each other, check on each other.
Mental health is also in the spotlight tonight. An extra $2.3 billion will be allocated to counselling and suicide prevention. COVID-19 has seen demand for services soar, and there have been warnings not addressing the crisis will sap productivity. The last budget in October was criticised for neglecting women, and after months of discussion about misogyny and sexism, $3.4 billion has been allocated to women's health and economic security in an 81-page statement. Half the cash, $1.7 billion, is to boost childcare subsidies. There's also $165 million in financial support for women to escape domestic violence and $129 million for increased legal assistance. Of course, the government's biggest task still remains leading the nation out of the pandemic. On the health front, another $1.5 billion is being spent funding extra medical services like telehealth appointments. An extra $1.9 billion is going towards the ongoing rollout of vaccines. And a yet-to-be-disclosed amount has been set aside to work towards domestic production of mRNA vaccines like the Pfizer jab. On the economic recovery front, the focus is skills. $2.7 billion is being spent creating 170,000 new apprenticeships and traineeships, and those unemployed as a result of COVID-19 will be encouraged to take a new course. As in any budget, there are also billions sloshing about for other notable programs, like about $20.7 billion in incentives to get businesses to spend on new equipment, large sums of cash allocated for infrastructure, an additional $13.2 billion for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and $7.8 billion to extend the low and middle income tax offset. All this spending means at some point there will be a big bill. Our debt is forecast to peak at around $980 billion, or nearly 41% of GDP in mid-2025. But there's also never been a better time to borrow. Interest-free payments are cheaper now than 3 years ago. That's good news if you're a government with an election on the horizon. Do you think this will get you another term?
It's not about us. This is about the Australian people.
The biggest economic danger of this pandemic has proved to be uncertainty. Vaccine rollout hiccups, virus mutations or diplomatic tensions could quickly see some of the rosy budget assumptions disappear out the door.
While the Treasurer makes his way to our Parliament House studio for analysis, I'm joined by the ABC's political editor Andrew Probyn, 730's chief political correspondent Laura Tingle and ABC business editor Ian Verinder. Andrew Probyn, what's your take?
Well, this is the hot chocolate budget. Everyone's a winner, Lee. That's the truth. Women, older Australians, businesses, big and small, taxpayers, low and middle income earners, they're all winners in this ideologically bending, big spending bonanza. The coalition's obsession with debt and deficit can't be seen, neither can a pathway to surplus. Josh Frydenberg says this spending is needed to assure this recovery and to guard against uncertainties. But the economy looks like it's roaring back, and he's using this opportunity to spend on either political vulnerabilities or areas of perceived Labor strength: aged care, health, childcare, and mental health. All up, $110 billion has arrived in Treasury coffers since December, of which $96 billion has been spent tonight. So it looks and smells, Lee, very much like a pre-election budget.
Laura Tingle?
Well, Lee, you mentioned in the introduction the subject of vaccines and quarantine. The interesting thing to me about this budget is the composition of growth, and effectively that in 2021 and right into 2022, the assumption is that the borders will be closed. Now that takes the pressure off the vaccination rollout, which, as you say, has been a bit flawed to date, but it means that we're basically relying on ourselves for growth other than those price signals we get from iron ore, the price surge we get from iron ore, which helps boost tax collections for the government. So what we're seeing forecast for the budget for the economy for the coming financial year is an economy that is still being really driven along by the impact of all of that stimulus from last year. It's going to provide about 5% growth to the economy, and then household consumption, based on the fact that everybody's now confident that the worst is behind them, is going to be the real driver in 21-22 before gradually business finally comes in and starts to play a really big role in 21-22. So it's an economy that's still cut off from the world. The benefit of that is we get about $20 billion of funding that we'd otherwise be spending in Bali or somewhere else overseas, and that's going to come into the coffers of the local economy.
Ian Verinder, what strikes you?
Lee, I think it's a very smart budget from a political point of view because we do have an election looming in the next year. It's economically sound because it addresses a lot of deficiencies that are in the system, but it does beg the question as to whether or not this represents a change in philosophy for this government. I mean, all we've heard about from the coalition for half a century is really about austerity, small government. This is a big spending budget at a time when we've got massive deficits extending out to the horizon and net debt approaching $1 trillion in a couple of years' time.
Ian, is there any actual structural budget reform in this?
There's nothing unexpected in this budget at all. What we're seeing is a continuation of quite a few of the policies that were instituted last year to try and, boost economic growth. We've seen for business an extension of the instant asset write-off, which allows them to buy equipment and write it off immediately. We've seen from a household point of view an extension of that low and middle income tax break. So not a lot of direct stimulus that you can see there. I think a lot of the stimulus programs are for aged care, for women's to help women and childcare issues. There's billions of dollars up for grabs right there.
Laura, in the Treasurer's press conference this afternoon, the journalist Samantha Maiden asked an interesting question, which is, if the assumption is that the whole population will be vaccinated by the end of the year, why aren't the international borders opening until the middle of next year? What are the calculations going on about potential election timing?
I don't know about whether it's about election timing so much, Lee, as the fact that it is going to take a long time to open the borders up. I mean, the budget papers show that they're planning on having small runs of international students coming into the country from later on in this year. And when the borders do open, it'll be in a very measured way, I think. So that explains that time differential in the budget, I think, which really is, I think, a reasonable one to make. The big question for the budget in the longer term is what happens when we sort of lose the impact of all the stimulus that we've had, which will be in the year after next, and we really will need the stimulus of people coming back into the economy, migrants, permanent and temporary, coming back in, and that's going to really put the pressure on the government to really open up the system, whether they like it or not.
Andrew, the Prime Minister's had a politically problematic few months between the sluggish vaccine rollout and women's issues. What does he need this budget to do for him politically?
Well, he needs this budget to neutralise some of those points of niggle, especially on the women's front. Now, there's about $3.5 billion that you could loosely describe as women's spending, but that includes a childcare spending. As my wife would remind me, childcare has benefited me as much as it has her. But this is a very political document, and almost by necessity, given that it could be the last budget before that election, be it at the end of the year, which will still be a temptation if the vaccine rollout is sorted, or more likely, I think, from March onwards.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. The Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, has made his way from the House of Representatives and he joins me now. Thank you very much, Treasurer.
Nice to be with you.
The budget's based on a series of assumptions, and they are that the whole Australian population will be vaccinated by the end of the year, that there'll be no sustained state border closures this year and no major COVID outbreaks, and that international borders will start to operate, reasonably normally by the middle of next year. Those are very uncertain and heroic assumptions, aren't they?
Well, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and making assumptions during normal times is difficult. To make them during the middle of a pandemic is even more so. Those assumptions are based on the best available evidence to us. We know that more than 10% of the Australian population has now received their first dose. We've seen 30% of those aged over 70 above receive a dose. We saw more than 400,000 doses rolled out over the course of the last week, more supplies coming online. So that is the assumption about vaccines. And with respect to international borders, it's quite a conservative, cautious assumption that international borders will gradually reopen from the middle of next year.
The economic recovery has come much faster than you anticipated in the budget just 6 months ago. You've had 2 quarters of the fastest economic growth on record. Employment is far rosier than expected. Given that, why the need to keep government spending so high?
Well, we're very much in the middle of a pandemic, and if you look around the world, there is a lot of uncertainty, more than 800,000 global cases a day. Europe has just gone into a double-dip recession, and here in Australia, we just saw Western Australia have a statewide lockdown. So our recovery needs to be secured, and that's why this job focused primarily on supporting more jobs through investments in skills and infrastructure, the digital economy, and tax relief for families, and also to support businesses make more investments. They're the initiatives that we put in place designed to boost aggregate demand, overall economic activity, and create more jobs, because we cannot take the gains that we've made for granted.
Let's talk about the size of government spending. Last year it was 32% of GDP. For the next 4 years it will never go lower than 26% of GDP. The Coalition was absolutely screaming blue murder when Labor was at 25.9% during the global financial crisis, claiming that was waste and profligacy.
Well, Lee, look at the context in which we're operating. A once-in-a-century pandemic and the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. What has happened with COVID-19 has dwarfed what happened during the GFC. We saw 1.3 million Australians either lose their jobs or so their working hours reduced to zero, and that is what required us to spend an unprecedented amount of money on direct economic support programs like JobKeeper, which helped keep 3.8 million Australians in a job. So that was what was required. What you see in this budget, just to point out, what you see in this budget is that the deficits come down by 2/3 over the forward estimates, and net debt as a proportion of GDP, which is a key indicator of fiscal sustainability, comes down every year compared to what was forecast at the last budget just over 6 months ago.
You raised JobKeeper. When you're spending at this level, I assume that you would agree that there should be no waste or inefficiency. Why aren't you then chasing down firms that banked JobKeeper as a profit when they never really needed it and taking that back to spend on things that are needed?
Well, at the time, our priority was to get the money out the door. You remember
no one disputes that. I totally don't dispute that. I'm just wondering why you're not chasing it now.
And so the rules and the law that passed the Parliament was that businesses could access JobKeeper based on an anticipated turnover reduction of more than 30% or 50%, depending on the size of the company. That was the rules in which the companies accepted that money, and it worked. It helped stabilise the economy. So we're not going to retrospectively change the legislation. We're not going to knock on the door of every small business that happens to be profitable.
If this happened under Labor in power, you'd be outraged that they were just writing it off and that there was no accountability for that.
Whichever way you look at it, JobKeeper has been an incredibly successful program. One could argue Australia's most successful
of course, but that doesn't mean that it's
without.
Just because it did do the job it was intended doesn't mean that it's flawless or that there wasn't waste built into it. And as I point out, if you're spending at these levels, surely trying to minimise waste and inefficiency has to be an utter priority.
Well, again, it worked very effectively through the tax system. You remember the debate? Labor asked us to extend JobKeeper beyond a year. We said no. It was costing at that time more than $2 billion a month, and we have seen in the month of April more than 100,000 people come off income support even as JobKeeper ended. So Labor said that they would spend more. They said that the sky would fall in if JobKeeper ended. It hasn't, and that step that we took, that decision we took, has proven to be the right one.
You want unemployment below 5%. Without open borders, how are you going to get enough workers to fill the vacancies in the sectors where they're needed?
Well, there are workforce shortages. You've identified a real issue in various aspects of the economy, the agriculture sector being one. We are working through this budget on increased programs in relation to skills and training. We have announced tonight an extra $500 million for the Job Trainer program to take it to $2 billion to support 450,000 places. The apprenticeship program has been very successful, Lee. We've tonight invested $2.7 billion in 170,000 new apprentices, and we're also focused on getting the long-term unemployed into work by boosting the subsidies and the grants that are available to employers who take them on, as well as a focus on foundational skills like maths and English and computer literacy for those who are out of work. So there's a lot of measures that we're taking.
Even with that though, with the borders closed, you've got a problem. So let's take mental health as an example. The government's putting $2.3 billion into mental health services. But if you talk to anybody at the moment trying to get in to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or people who work in that field, they will tell you that you just cannot get an appointment. There's no way around that because you can't just magic up psychologists and psychiatrists out of the domestic pool.
So you'll be pleased to know in this budget there's more money for actually training people to work in the mental health space.
But those degrees take like 6 years.
Including for psychiatrists and the like. This is a record spend on mental health, everything from expanding the successful Headspace centres to putting in place Head to Health new adult centres for those aged 25 and above based on the Headspace model. We also have additional support that we're rolling out when it comes to mental health to treat people who need it most.
The budget sets this out as a two-stage recovery. The first part's led by government spending and then there's a transition to private sector-led investment. But when vaccination's lagging behind world's best practice, when there's no detailed roadmap for when or how borders will open, when the state premiers close down their states for 1 or 2 cases of COVID, how can the private sector plan to invest with any kind of certainty?
Well, they are right now. Because what we've seen is investment in machinery and equipment at near highest levels in almost 7 years off the back of the government incentives that we've put in place in last budget and extended in this budget. Business conditions have reached a record high. Consumer confidence at its highest level in 11 years, and you've got more Australians in work than ever before. I know it's easy to be critical about various things, but I do want to point out that Australia right now is ahead of the global pack when it comes to our economic and our health recovery. No one's taking that for granted. No one thinks that the job is done. It's far from over in that respect. That's why this budget seeks to lock in the recovery with a whole series of new investments.
If I can ask in detail about aged care, there's $17.7 billion extra dollars in here over the next 5 years. But if we can go back to first principles, isn't the core problem here that it's a sector that's being run for profit? So there is an inbuilt incentive to deliver the bare minimum care allowable in order to maximise profit?
Well, firstly, there's a large not-for-profit aspect to the aged care sector as well. But I would challenge that assumption. I would say to you that the people even working in the for-profit aspect or sector with respect to aged care are deeply committed to their residents, are deeply committed to the highest quality care that is provided.
Look at what we've seen, Treasurer. I mean, my point, I guess, is, you know, if you can give somebody, say, a $6 meal of chicken nuggets and frozen carrots, then what incentive is there to give them a $12 meal of roast chicken and fresh vegetables?
Well, in terms of what we're trying to do with the residential sector, what we're seeking to make it more sustainable for the longer term, and we're increasing the base funding by an extra $10 per resident per day. That's going to be welcome by the sector. We're increasing the amount of time that's required from carers and from nurses to spend with residents. We're releasing 80,000 new home care packages. They're level 3 and level 4 packages predominantly, and that's going to be of great help to people who need it. And we've got 33,000 new training places for those in the care sector, as well as a whole host of other measures to strengthen our regulatory agencies, to put in place a new act and to boost the infrastructure spending on aged care facilities. So this is a very comprehensive program of initiatives that responds to the Royal Commission, and I think it will make a real difference on the ground.
On that, say, $10 a day, how do you know, though, that, say, like the JobKeeper plan that sort of went into dividends and bottom line in some cases, how do you know that the $10 will actually filter through to residents and it won't be put in the pockets of aged care providers?
Again, we're putting in place a new regulator who will work closely with the sector. We're putting an extra hundreds of extra audits every year. There's going to be new powers for the regulators, a more coordinated system to ensure that the money being spent is getting to the residents.
One of the things you want to prioritise is innovation. You want a thriving gaming industry, medical research, biotech and so on. Yet there's basically nothing in this budget for universities, which are reeling from the loss of international students. How can the government be serious about cutting-edge innovation and research without a serious injection of money into universities?
Well, firstly, there is $19 billion a year going to our universities. We actually guaranteed that base funding from domestic students to universities through the pandemic. And tonight I said in my speech that as a result of our measures we've announced through the pandemic, there's an extra 30,000 university places. And last year's budget, which was just over 6 months ago, Lee, I announced an extra $1 billion for research. So we're deeply committed to that sector. But what we'd also like to see is, and it's happening right now across the country, is close collaboration and coordination between our universities and our industries. Because take an area like medical technology and biotech, CSL, a great Australian company, has been driven by research done at the University of Melbourne and through our universities more broadly. And tonight we've announced a new innovation called a patent box, where patents that have been registered in Australia and derive income for a particular company can be taxed at a lower concessional rate at around 17%. And because we've developed Wi-Fi here in Australia, the bionic ear, the cervical cancer vaccine, we want to see more commercialisation here in Australia of those technologies countries, and putting in place a patent box that is in place in other countries like Singapore and France and the Netherlands and the UK is, I think, a step towards that goal.
The budget notes that you'll start to pay back Australia's debt when the economic recovery is secured. It makes no mention of how that will be measured, the timing of it, or any target on it whatsoever. How is this possible, debt just as far as the eye can see, when for a decade the Coalition did not stop railing about the evils of leaving future generations to pay off debt?
Well, let me remind you, when we went into this crisis, we had delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years.
But
and
no,
you
actually,
no.
I don't want to get back into the back in black thing, and I'm surprised that you raised it actually. But
No,
let me make the point. My point is, as you well know, Treasurer, that the Coalition's rhetoric on debt was that it was pure evil, and now you're arguing when it's needed that you embrace it. It's a total shift in rhetoric.
Well, you're raising a historical case, so let me raise one with you. When we went into the budget, to the pandemic, we had successfully balanced the budget for the first time in 11 years by getting welfare dependency down to its lowest level in 30 years. Now, COVID hit. Even after the drought and even after the bushfires, we were still on track for the surplus, but then COVID hit. And as I said earlier, this has been the most significant economic shock since the Great Depression.
So
and at times of national
warranted.
crises, there are no ideological constraints, and we spent as required. And as we grow the economy, as we've seen in tonight's budget, we get a dividend from more people being in work, so higher income tax receipts and lower welfare payments. That is going to help ensure that our debt to GDP, which is a key measure of our fiscal sustainability, reduces over time.
Treasurer, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
David Spears is the host of the ABC's Insiders program, and he's with us now. David, what stood out to you tonight in the Treasurer's remarks?
Well, just listening to that interview, it's clear, Lee, there is some sensitivity around the level of spending and debt involved in all of this. Understandable, I suppose, given, as you highlight there, what the Coalition used to say about debt and deficit and so on. Look, he is defending it by justifying the fact that we are still in a crisis. This pandemic is not over. And I don't think there will be a huge amount of argument about the need for more spending right now. What we are, however, seeing is a shift in the budget approach. Last year, yes, a lot of spending on big temporary measures, JobKeeper, JobSeeker and so on. This year, the spending does involve some continuation of some of those temporary stimulus measures, but also baked in structural, permanent spending. And that goes to things like the aged care spend, mental health, childcare, the $50 a fortnight increase in JobSeeker as well. A lot of this is badly needed, particularly aged care. This is a big reform tonight, long overdue to deal with the neglect, the abuse, the problems that you highlighted in that interview as well that we've long known about, particularly after the Royal Commission. So yes, that's justified, but it does mean structurally, without putting in place an aged care levy or any more user pays, that is going to be a strain on the budget. And the budget papers do show that for the next decade, we're still going to have the budget in what's called a structural deficit. Long after the worst of this pandemic has passed, we will still be in a structural deficit. And then you get, I think, to what's going to be a sharpened debate around the Stage 3 tax cuts. They're due to come in from 2024. They do heavily favour those on higher incomes, and they'll come in when the budget's already in a structural deficit. So I think we will see a much sharper debate if Labor chooses to pick a fight on this about whether they should go ahead or not. We're getting a lot of reaction on some of the key measures in tonight's budget, but I want to go first to a panel of economists. Chris Richardson, the renowned budget watcher from Deloitte Access Economics, and Gabriella De Souza, the senior economist at CEDA, joining us this evening. Chris, to you first. We know the recovery has been better than expected over the last 6 months, but we also know there's a lot of global uncertainty still with this pandemic. Is this the right budget for the times?
Oh, look, it absolutely is. The fight against COVID is becoming, in particular, a fight against unemployment. Now, that's the correct economic priority, but it also lines up with other things. There was a policy priority, a need to spend more on the likes of aged care and other social programs, and of course the ever-present political priority. An election not enormously far away. It's unusual to have that combination of stars aligning, but broadly doing the right thing on the economy has been doing the right thing on policy, aged care and the job creation potential there, and the politics lining up as well.
Gabriella, one of the big questions is what sort of economy are we going to have post-COVID? Will it be any stronger, any more resilient, any fairer than it was pre-COVID. What does this budget tonight tell us?
Well, we've seen from a migration perspective that obviously over the next couple of years the government has no faith in net overseas migration numbers going positive, but they do forecast that happening in 2023-2024. In fact, quite a strong growth in that year of 201,000, which is much more in line with what we had pre-COVID.
Chris, I mentioned the spending that we see tonight's a mixture of some temporary but also a fair bit of baked-in permanent spending increase. What sort of shape does that leave the budget in?
Look, not great shape. When you prioritise unemployment, it does cost more. The government's spending another $18 or $20 billion a year. That's about 1% of national income. And although we shouldn't be focusing on budget repair now, one of the great things that Australia had through this crisis was a strong enough budget to be able to use that budget as a shield. And so eventually, and you don't need to do it fast, you would want to try to repair that budget. That's now harder with this new spending. And you know, announcing the new spending is the easy bit. There's the applause tonight around that, and there should be. But the hard bit, paying for it, and all those trickier debates, they've been kicked down the track.
They will come. Gabriella, final one to you. You mentioned the migration issue. The budget suggests that the international border won't begin to reopen until about mid-next year. What does that mean for the economy in the meantime?
Look, I think it's going to be devastating for the economy in the meantime. You know, we've had 1.5% of population growth pre-COVID, and we're looking at 0.1% in the coming years, 0.2% thereafter, not getting to pre-COVID levels until much after that. You know, we're seeing 2 years of negative net overseas migration, which is also going to be quite bad for us and for some of those key sectors. Of course, the government's suggesting that, you know, we'll open international borders again, particularly to international education in the future. But, you know, all of that hinges on our quarantine capacity and how well our vaccination program is going. Quarantine capacity, obviously, there's not much in the budget around any funding for federal quarantine. It seems like the federal government is leaving that up to the states for the most part. Obviously with the exception of repatriating Australians.
Gabriella D'Souza and Chris Richardson, thanks both very much for joining us. Lee, back to you.
Thanks, David. Wages growth in Australia has been sluggish for years, and the budget forecasts that few of us should expect a pay rise anytime soon. Casey Briggs takes a look at when or if that might change.
When was the last time you had a pay rise? Across the economy, they've been getting rarer and smaller. Not just because of the pandemic, this has been a feature of our economy for years. 20 years ago, the wage price index showed wages reliably growing by more than 3% a year. But that started to fall around 2013, sliding down into the low twos. Every year since 2015, Treasury has projected wage growth will shoot back to historical norms. It never has. It's actually weakened further. Now, wage growth has been at record lows for 2 quarters in a row. Meanwhile, the cost of many essentials has outstripped wages. Here's how much hourly wages have changed since the year 2000. And here is how the price of housing has grown over the same period, according to CoreLogic, an increase in value of nearly 200%. Those ambitious wage growth projections from previous years are nowhere to be seen in this year's budget. Treasury has changed the model for estimating wage growth. And this budget doesn't forecast an improvement in the wage price index above 3% before mid-2025, seemingly locking in a decade's worth of low wages growth. The theory is that unemployment needs to be way lower to push wages up. Josh Frydenberg wants the unemployment rate to start with a 4, and the government has declared job creation a top priority of its economic plan. It's right there in paragraph 1 of the first budget paper. What's new to try and do that? There's an extra $2.7 billion in new wage subsidies for apprentices, worth up to $28,000 per worker, $500 million in funding for youth employment services, and another $500 million if it's matched by the states to fund 163,000 training places, including tens of thousands in aged care skills. In this budget, Treasury forecasts the unemployment rate will fall to 4.5% by mid-2024. That's more cautious than the Reserve Bank, which has projected it'll get there far sooner, by the end of next year. Training unemployed people with job skills is one thing, but there are still many more job seekers than job vacancies. And with industries recovering at different paces out of the COVID-19 pandemic, what's the chance that employment growth remains spotty across different parts of the economy for some time to come?
For the opposition's view of this year's budget, I'm joined now by the Shadow Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, in Canberra. Jim Chalmers, this is a budget that one could imagine Labor delivering, government spending going to aged care, childcare, the NDIS, mental health. It doesn't leave you anywhere to go with your economic policy in an election year.
Well, their heart's not in it, Lee, and I think the Australian people have learned not to take too seriously what the government announces on budget night. They know that there's barely a relationship between what they announce and what's actually delivered.
Whether their heart's in it or not, that's what they've announced, all of that spending.
Well, they've done that for political reasons, Lee. They've done that to cobble together these political fixes to try and get them through to an election before they revert to type. There's still important differences between Liberal and Labor when it comes to the budget. We've still got a higher priority on cleaner and cheaper energy, social housing, proper investment in good, secure, well-paid jobs and all the rest of it for all the reasons that Casey just ran through. So I think there are still important differences between the parties.
Unemployment's forecast to fall to 4.75%. What target does Labor think the economy should aspire to?
Well, first of all, that target's largely disappeared from the budget papers. It was a speech that Josh Frydenberg gave a couple of weeks ago about getting closer to full employment. It's almost entirely absent from the budget tonight. I'm not sure what happened to it. We've said for some time that part of the task here is to get closer to full employment, whether that's 4 or 4.5%, whatever the economic consensus is. But there's a bigger story there as well, and that's underemployment. And that's been a problem in this economy for 8 long years of this coalition government. If you don't address underemployment, you won't get people back into work sufficiently to get those wages growing again. Wages growth has been missing from the economy for 8 long years, and the budget today actually has real wages going backwards, despite $100 billion in new spending and $1 trillion in debt. I think that's an admission of failure.
Given where the economic indicators are at, better than expected, does Labor think that the current magnitude of government spending is appropriate?
Well, there's two aspects to that. Of course, the economy's recovering. That's a good thing. It's a credit to the Australian people who did the right thing by each other in limiting the spread of the virus. We've been entirely consistent throughout and said when the economy is weak, there's a role for government to step in, even if that means some additional debt. We've been responsible, constructive and consistent about that throughout. But you need to have actually something to show for that debt. Our concern is that this government's racked up $1 trillion in debt and they don't have enough to show for it.
But come on, something to show for it. The economy's performing better than any country in the world and we're basically COVID-free.
Well, that's overwhelmingly, the credit for that overwhelmingly belongs to the Australian people. And I know Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison will try and claim credit for it, but Australians did the right thing to limit the spread of the virus. That's overwhelmingly why the economy's recovering. That's a good thing, but there's still 2 million Australians either unemployed or without enough hours to support their loved ones. So the Treasurer might want to talk about the economic engine roaring back to life, but Australians know that that engine has a number of gears and at least 2 million, almost 2 million Australians are still stuck in reverse.
What's going to be the path out of debt for Australia?
Well, there's a combination of things, Lee. Principally, first and foremost, we need to get the economy growing so that we can get that debt as a proportion of the economy down. That's important. At some future point, a government of either political persuasion will need to think about budget repair. And absent from the budget today is any sense of how this record $1 trillion in debt, many multiples of what the government inherited from Labor, there's no sense of a plan about how the government will get that back under control.
What do you mean by budget repair? Do you mean increased taxes or cutting spending? What do you mean?
Well, I think it's broadly acknowledged there are 3 ways to repair the budget: growth, spending and revenue. Some combination of that. Governments of either persuasion will have to contemplate that at some point. The government's gone silent on it, not because they don't want to cut back the budget, but because they don't want to tell us how until after the election.
Is it fair to say that you don't believe that that debt will be entirely paid back by purely relying on economic growth?
Well, I think that's the first task. I mean, it remains to be seen what kind of budget we would inherit and the best way to get that debt to more manageable levels when that's appropriate. We've said, obviously, right now there's a case to support the economy. Jobs need to be the priority over debt. But we will be left with an extraordinary amount of debt, many multiples of what the coalition inherited. At some future point, governments will need to think about how that is paid back. First priority there is to get the economy growing, but governments of either persuasion will have to consider other measures too. I think the government has in their back pocket a plan to cut the budget severely, but they won't want to talk about it until after the election.
Do you think that Australia is going to have enough workers and the workers with the right skills to fill, to achieve what you said, would be ideal, 4%, 4.5% unemployment, or as the budget papers forecast, 4.75%?
Well, we've got two sets of issues there. Obviously, unemployment and underemployment's too high to get that wages growth, but there's also some structural issues which are preventing people from taking up those opportunities. At a time when we don't have the skills system right, there have been big cuts to apprenticeships over the last 8 years. We've got skills mismatches, the adaptation of technology, concentrated and cascading disadvantage and long-term unemployment, issues around childcare. There's a whole range of issues which are preventing people from grabbing those opportunities in the economy. Those structural issues have gotten worse over the last 8 years of this government, and they need to be addressed.
Jim Chalmers, thanks very much.
Thank you, Lee.
David Spears joins me again from Canberra. David, has the coalition cut Labor's grass with this budget?
Yes, it has, Lee. I mean, look, clearly Labor has less ammunition now, at the very least, on aged care, mental health, support for women, the childcare. They'll argue at the edges that they're doing more on each of these things or better at each of these things. But yes, there's no doubt the government has gone out of its way to try and deal with areas of political vulnerability, areas that Labor had been talking about for a while. We hear Jim Chalmers say he'll want to shift the debate onto wages, but we don't yet know what Labor's answer is to getting that wages growth going. Let's look at what's in the budget for workers and business. We're joined by Jennifer Westacott, the CEO of the Business Council of Australia, and Michelle O'Neill, the President of the ACTU. Thank you both for joining us. Michelle, to you first on that question about wages. I mean, the budget's clear. They're going to remain pretty flat for a while yet. What is the key to unlocking wages growth?
Well, the government has failed to do two key things that are critical in this budget, and that's to address the fact that we need to increase wages and see wage growth, as you said, David, but also that we need to deal with the crisis in insecure work. There's nothing in this budget that means that we're going to see the creation of secure, reliable jobs that workers can see pay increases coming along out of. If you don't create secure jobs, if you don't see jobs where people know how much they're going to earn week to week and month to month, then they've got less bargaining power, and we're not going to see that wage growth. And in fact, the forecast in the budget is for wages, real wage growth, to be flat right through to 23-24. We've got a crisis in wages in Australia, and nothing in this budget is going to address that.
Jennifer Westacott, the biggest spending measure tonight in the budget isn't actually aged care. It's continuing the business investment incentives, loss carryback and so on. Is this what business was after?
Look, business was after, obviously, a budget that drove private sector recovery. Many of the measures are going to do that, not just the tax measures you've just talked about, but the huge investment in skills, infrastructure, the digital announcements that were made a couple of weeks ago. Those are all going to drive stronger business investment. And look, I agree with Michelle. We want to see higher wages, but the way to get that is higher productivity driven by higher business investment, making it easier for businesses to expand, grow what they're doing, export more, do more. And of course, all of this relies on us getting our economy open again, gradual, careful plan to get our domestic borders permanently open and get our international borders gradually open.
Well, let me ask you both about that. Michelle, the international border not due to begin reopening until mid-next year, according to the budget. Is that appropriate? Would you like to see it sooner than that? Or are you happy to lock out migrant workers, for example, until then?
Well, we've always said it has to be, borders decisions have got to be based on the very best medical and expert advice, and that continues to be our position. But also, we don't accept this notion that what's needed in terms of getting workers into the sectors that are crying out for it is short-term visa workers. What we know is needed is to make sure that there's improved security in those jobs and wages in those jobs. What we've seen government do is put billions of dollars into the private sector in this budget, but it's without strings attached. It doesn't link that money, that large amounts of money that Jennifer was just talking about, to the fact that there needs to be tied to the creation of secure, reliable jobs with better pay. And this, of course, would make a difference in terms of many of the sectors that are saying they have trouble in terms of finding workers. And if we're going to do something about people coming back to the country, we need to do it in a careful and staged way, and in a way that's going to support local jobs as well. So an example would would be overseas students. That would be a group of people that we should look at coming back when it's safe to do so, but it would support increased jobs and job security in the higher education sector, which has been abandoned, as well as providing more workers that would be available who are those overseas students too.
And Jennifer, just a quick one finally to you on back on the border issue. There is a bit of vagueness, a bit of uncertainty around how this will happen. Would business like to see more certainty, more clear benchmarks around how and when the borders reopened?
Yeah, we've been calling for this for a long time, as you know. We want to see a plan that shows, as we roll out the vaccine, what can we start to open. Obviously international students are a priority, but so are those skilled workers. And I just take issue a little bit with Michelle there. What companies say to me is, if you want us to invest in Australia, we need some of these skills. We need to bring them from other countries because we don't have some of these skills in Australia. And that will get us the capacity to create these new industries, these new higher paying jobs, and obviously bring that innovation and drive into the economy. So we need to be firing on all fronts. We need to be thinking big. If I've got one concern about the budget, David, it's the low growth rates in the outer years. We need to think bigger than that. We need to have a bigger level of ambition, because that's what's going to drive up wages.
Jennifer Westacott, Michelle O'Neill, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us tonight. And Lee,
Thanks,
back to
David.
you.
Thank you. When Australia closed its borders last year, few sectors were hit harder than international education. Tonight's budget includes a $53 billion rescue package for the sector, although, as I mentioned earlier, universities can expect little, and Australia will remain closed to overseas students for longer than previously expected. ABC data journalist Inga Ting has more.
Australia's international education sector has hemorrhaged billions since the start of the pandemic. And now it's bracing for further pain. The budget's key assumptions implicitly acknowledge the effect of Australia's delayed vaccine rollout on reopening our borders. A population-wide vaccination program is now only likely to be in place by the end of 2021, compared to the mid-year outlook, which just 5 months ago assumed it would be fully in place by late 2021. This year's budget also assumes our international border will remain closed until mid-next year, at least 6 months longer than previously forecast. Meanwhile, small phased programs to return international students are now only expected to start late this year, a full 12 months later than last year's budget forecast. This year's budget does throw a $53.6 million lifeline to private colleges aimed at boosting their domestic and online enrolments. But experts say that's a drop in the ocean for an industry shedding billions for every semester that international students can't enter the country. Having foreign students inside Australia matters because they spend money beyond their tuition fees. Of the $40 billion international education generated in 2019, 57% was from spending in the broader economy, mostly on housing, hospitality and retail. But overseas student arrivals have plummeted since Australia shut its borders. New visa approvals have collapsed to 1/3 of pre-pandemic levels, while in February just 200 international students arrived on shore, compared to more than 120,000 the previous February. The sector lost $5.3 billion in 2020, but experts warn the worst is yet to come, since so far it's been propped up by students still finishing courses they were enrolled in before Australia locked its doors. Modelling from the Mitchell Institute shows that keeping the border closed to the end of the year will cost the sector more than $13 billion. That's 1/3 of its 2019 value. And if further delays keep Australia locked off to the end of 2022, this could blow out to nearly $20 billion, halving the value of the sector in just 3 years.
After last year's budget, some critics accused the Morrison government of ignoring women. This time around, after months of coverage of issues such as workplace sexual harassment and domestic violence, the government has put a much stronger focus on policy areas that affect women. I'm joined now by the ABC's chief online political writer, Annabelle Crabb, and the CEO of SNAKE, the national voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, Catherine Little. Annabelle Crabb, firstly, what's your assessment at a glance?
Well, the last budget was only 6 months ago, and it came in the middle of the pandemic that hit women's jobs, worse than men's jobs, and women also picked up a whole lot of extra unpaid labour over the course of that pandemic. So when you look down the expenditure list in the last budget and you saw this money going into manufacturing, infrastructure, and areas that traditionally employ more men, it did feel like a bit of a slap in the face. And it was very much heartily denied at the time that it was a blokey budget by the government. They said that women like roads too and run small businesses too and so on. But I think if you have a look at tonight's budget, you can see a real shift. And it's not just the $3.4 billion worth of spending that's outlined in the 85-page document that's the women's document that replaces the sort of couple of photocopied sheets of paper that we scored last year, Lee. It is actually a shift in focus of the sort of industries that are concerned in the top tier spending items. So you've got spending on aged care, childcare, mental health. These are areas where women are actually employed.
Catherine, how will Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families be affected by the new childcare funding announcement?
Oh, look, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. You know, there are certainly, I know the word was used, targeted low and middle income earners, but I think at first glance, and certainly what we know is a lot more structural reform was actually needed for that to land for the most vulnerable families. The activity test is still there. That's a bit of a problem. And certainly the ability to access the number of hours that our children, those most vulnerable children, needed to access. You know, the evidence says 30 hours per week. That actually isn't there because it's based and predicated on your ability to score high on that activity test. So there are some gaps there, some really big fundamental gaps, particularly if we're talking about being able to enable our families and our women to get back into the workforce. But there are also some really big wins in the budget as well.
And with those areas that are wins, where would you like to see that money targeted? In what way could it be most effective?
Oh, look, targeted, that's really easy. Every Aboriginal organisation under the sun is going to tell you invest in the Aboriginal services because they look at a more holistic response and they deal with the problems on the ground and they really, really focus on early intervention. And again, I would say that that's probably a weakness in the budget. We're not seeing at this point in time where the early interventions are. Having said that, again, most Aboriginal people and Aboriginal organisations are going to say to you, this is a wait and see budget because we know that we're still waiting for significant announcements that will line up in the middle of the year with the Closing the Gap implementation plan. So there are signals and there are indications, particularly around those really big ticket items, that there's money there waiting to be, I guess, negotiated and dropped down. But we are still waiting to see how that all looks.
Annabelle, I wanted to ask you about the underlying assumption that childcare is a women's issue. It's in the women's part of the budget, right? We know that that is true because women do take a disproportionate load of caring responsibilities. But what is the answer to addressing this as a structural issue so that childcare is not linked to women's participation in the workforce?
Yeah, the labelling does bother me a little bit. I mean, if you look at the budget overview, the Women's Economic Security Package is basically what they're calling the childcare package. And it means that it kind of, it banks in this assumption that somehow childcare is just about women. Now, it's true that the participation upsides from investing in childcare are really in women moving into the workforce. But if you were trying to think laterally about this, you'd change some of the assumptions that we have from the time of a baby's birth about whose job it is to look after that child. And I mean, parental leave in this country, paid parental leave, the public kind, is only available to women and then they can assign it to their male partner. I think if you were going to think really laterally about this, you would change those assumptions from the start and that would feed into a more equitable way of thinking about childcare and also whose responsibility it is. I mean, we still hypothecate childcare expenditure from a household against the mother's wage, as if it's only the mother that benefits from the ability to work when a child is cared for. All of that needs to change, I think.
Annabelle Crabb, Catherine Little, thanks to both of you for your time tonight. Thank you. Andrew Probert and Laura Tingle are back with us. Your final thoughts, Laura, first.
Well, Lee, I think the budget does deliver some important structural reform. The aged care package is, I think, much better than I thought it would be in terms of some of the quality measures, in terms of assuring quality of service, in terms of putting in the higher level aged care packages for home care. So I think that is a really significant change, and it's realistically timed in the sense that it will take a couple of years to build up the thousands and thousands of extra trained workers that you need in that sector. So I think you've got to give credit to the government for doing that. And I think the overall point that has to be made about this budget is the government has dumped debt and deficits. It's about creating jobs. That's taken the constraints off it getting back to surplus that we've been listening to for the last 10 or 15 years, and it's gone for it as a result.
Andrew?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, there is actually a little line item that doesn't have a cost attached to it, but it's the development of an Australian-made mRNA vaccine. Now, that's commercially and commercial in confidence, so it's not being shared widely. But that's fascinating. Another thing is the level ambition. We're being told and have been told for months now that the only way to get real wage rises and good wage rises is to bring unemployment down. Now, we're throwing, as an economy, $500 billion to get wage rises that are only in the 2.5, 2 3/4. So, as Jennifer Westacott was referring to before, to get really healthy wage rises, the ambition and possibly the spending is going to have to be even bigger.
Thank you to both of you. And that brings us to the end of the first hour of the ABC's special budget coverage. David Spears is up next with further analysis live from Canberra. I'll be back at 7:30 tomorrow, and the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, will be my guest. Until then, good night.
Well, coming up this hour, we're going to take a close look at the major reform in tonight's budget, the government's response to the Aged Care Royal Commission. Is it going to be enough to fix the abuse, the neglect, the staff shortages, the lack of basic care that's plagued this sector for too long? We'll hear from some immediate reaction from those who've been leading the charge for change. We're also going to hear from the tourism and hospitality sector. It's been very hard hit by the pandemic, of course. What's in the budget for this sector? It's a huge employer. And what will keeping that international border closed for at least another year mean? And how will all of this tonight set up Australia for the future? Are we simply snapping back to where we were pre-COVID? Or will we have a fairer, more productive, more resilient economy? First, let's recap what's in this budget. Much stronger than expected jobs growth over the past 6 months has driven a revenue windfall for the government. Record high iron ore prices have helped too. The budget is still deep in the red, but it's not as deep as had been feared. So what's being done with this windfall? Well, tax breaks for low and middle income earners and for businesses are being extended for another year. And the government's making some permanent spending increases as well tonight, most notably in aged care. Let's bring in Phil Curry, the political editor of the Australian Financial Review, for his take on it all. Phil Curry, thanks for joining us tonight. The government's justifying all the extra spending tonight because we're still in a pandemic, a crisis situation. But this has got to be the biggest social spending budget we've seen from a coalition government ever.
Oh, well, certainly in a long time. I mean, the Howard government sort of didn't mind spraying money at everybody but it had the money to do so.
But money in families' pockets, not social programs.
Yeah, look, it's very much. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but it could be a Labor budget insofar as it funds aged care, disabilities, mental health, low and middle income earners get a tax cut. It sort of ticks all those boxes. I mean, when Scott Morrison at the start of the pandemic, you remember when he was handing out all the assistance. He said, don't mistake this for a change in ideology, it's a crisis. Well, I think he's still in that mindset. They haven't snapped back to Liberal Party sort of fiscal rules.
What do you think, though? I mean, a lot of this is permanent structural increased spending.
Yeah. Well, and look, it has to be. I mean, the aged care, I don't think any government, whatever hue, could have ignored that Aged Care Royal Commission. In the Prime Minister's sort of defence, he called that Royal Commission. He could hardly then not respond to it. $18 billion is a fair chunk of cash, but it's for 4 years, and as you said, it's recurrent, goes beyond the 4 years. I assume the industry will probably say it's a welcome start, but more is needed. But it's going
to make a big change.
80,000 home care places if you can find the staff to do it. I mean, this is the challenge with aged care: is you can pour a lot of money into it. You need the workers, both in residential care and in home care. But he could hardly not respond to this Royal Commission, given he called it. But at the same time, where does Labor go with stuff like that? The NDIS, I think, is very interesting. Another $13 billion is needed. that is now going to cost as much as Medicare by the end of the forward estimate.
And that's just a growth of the scheme.
$32 billion. Then I think there's more coming in that space. They're going to have to put guardrails around it, otherwise it'll become unsustainable.
So yes, a lot of this is needed. No one's going to argue about that sort of spending, but in a budget sense, where does it leave things? Because you read the budget paper, we're still going to be in a structural deficit in a decade from now. Can the government still, in 3 or 4 years' time, proceed with the stage 3 tax cuts? They cost $17 billion a year.
Well, Josh Frydenberg in the press conference in the lockup said most definitely they will be. He's saying it's not just a spending measure, it's actually a productivity measure, it's a massive reform. 95% of income earners will pay no more than 30 cents in the dollar. I think that will become the flashpoint going into the next election. Labor's making a lot of noises about not proceeding with that.
They haven't made a final call.
No, but I'd be surprised if they support it given their rhetoric thus far. But look, David, deficit is one thing. I think the deficit's going to get down to $57 billion by the end of the forward estimates. That's still higher than Labor ever chalked up. The big one is debt. So we saw today the net debt, not the gross debt, but the net debt is now going to hit nearly $1 trillion by 2025. And the government has sort of shifted its stance, saying because the economy is growing larger than the debt, that means the proportion of debt as a percentage of the economy is getting smaller every year. And so we don't need to run a surplus budget anymore to combat that. Now that's
red is the new black.
That's pretty out there, but back to your original point, when we get to the other side of the election, there's a reckoning coming, especially when interest rates start rising. You're not going to be able to sustain that line.
Which brings me to the final question to you. When you look at tonight's budget, the sort of spending that's there, and I think it's nearly $10 billion or so in measures taken but not yet announced, which is usually the war chest. Does that spell to you an election this year rather than next year?
Look, I don't know. I still think the Prime Minister's inclination is to go next year, but if he chooses to go this year, this will give him ample platform to do so. If it's not the election budget, then it's a dress rehearsal. I think that's probably as far as we can say at this stage.
Phil Curry, thanks for your analysis tonight. Really appreciate that. Well, the budget papers also reveal the pandemic's put extra pressure on remote Indigenous communities struggling with unemployment. As part of its plan to create jobs in these areas, the government will scrap its controversial Remote Job Seeker program from 2023. We're going to be talking to our Indigenous Affairs correspondent Isabella Higgins coming up very shortly. First, though, I want to go to Jeremy Fernandez, who's going to be getting some instant reaction to the budget tonight from, well, some voters and some of those in the sectors that are being given a lot of attention in tonight's budget. Jeremy Fernandez, tell us firstly where you are and who you're talking to tonight.
David, welcome to the Wanneroo Sports and Social Club in Perth's northern suburbs. This is a bit of a community hub, the sort of thing you'll find in cities, country towns and suburbs right across Australia. Now, if you ask just about anyone out here, they'll tell you that they did not mark budget night in their diaries. However, this is exactly the sort of place where people come together with their family and friends to share a game, a drink or a meal, and to discuss and firm up their ideas about what it is this government stands for, its values, its priorities, where the nation's headed. WA's mining boom has pumped a lot more money than expected into the federal government's coffers in tax revenue. And so there's more money to spend. So who gets a leg up this budget? Who misses out? And ultimately, will it be enough to sway any votes as we head towards a federal election potentially in the next 12 months? So join us a little later as we step inside to take the very first taste test of the public this budget night.
Looking forward to that from Jeremy Fernandez coming up. We've got Isabella Higgins, our Indigenous Affairs correspondent, with us now. And I want to go to you, Isabella. I mentioned that in this budget, the government scrapped what's called the Remote Job Seeker program. That'll be from 2023. Just tell us, what is that Remote Job Seeker program? How does it work and what does this mean?
Well, David, the government's community development program, often referred to as CDP, was highly controversial, highly contentious. At times it was called discriminatory, at times it was called overly rigid. It was a program that saw remote job seekers work far more hours for the fairly modest welfare payment. far more hours than those in metro areas, and it was known for having quite a strict penalty regime. A 2018 review of this program found that it was actually those in Indigenous communities who were copping the majority of these fines. So there have been calls for a long time from Indigenous communities, from advocates, even from the federal opposition, to scrap this program. So it's quite interesting to see that as part of this jobs budget that the federal government is deciding to remove this program in 2023 and try something different to stimulate jobs growth, to make sure that employment grows in those areas in remote Indigenous communities where there has historically always been very high unemployment. Of course, we know that a lot of Indigenous Australians do live in our metro areas, in regional cities, and there wasn't a lot of targeted relief for them. And the other thing is, with the government saying we're going to try something new in 2023, well, we don't really know what that trying something new looks like. There isn't a lot of details in the budget about what that might look like. We do know that they will be doing a trial in 4 pilot locations around Australia later in the year. So I think there will be many people who will be happy to see the end of this program, those who have been advocating for it, but there's certainly a lot of people who will be looking for detail. There's certainly some positive signs in the budget. Specifically, they said they would be designing any alternatives with Indigenous communities, which will certainly be music to the ears of those who have been fighting for change in this area.
It sounds like there will be a debate about what will follow. Isabella Higgins, thank you very much for that this evening. The biggest ticket spending item in this budget, as we've been reporting this evening, is the government's response to the Aged Care Royal Commission. Now, before we dive into the details there, a reminder of some of the problems of abuse and neglect that the system has been suffering, a reminder from those who've seen these problems firsthand.
I started back when my father became ill with dementia. He was abused in care. It was a long battle. We didn't get any acknowledgement. I did make a submission to the Aged Care Commission, Royal Commission, about the abuse that my father suffered, and it put our family through a lot of emotional trauma.
If we don't take care of our elderly, how are we going to learn? I have had the best lessons in life from those I look after. They have taught me more than anyone else. Our elderly matter.
I care for my husband Brian and my sister Rhonda, who both have various health issues and have been put on a long waiting list, even though have been approved for packages. We will need to wait up to 12 months for the packages to come through for me to get assistance.
The one thing I think we need is more training for staff. The one thing I've heard, and it disappoints me, is that staff that think they don't need to be trained, that the way they've been doing it for the last 30 years is fine. I think if you're still caring for people the same way as you were 30 years ago today, then you're putting people at risk.
We don't have the knowledge of services to access, as well as we don't know how to access them, and there's a very long waiting list. I'm on a waiting list at the moment for domestic assistance as well as social support.
We need funding, but we need funding that is specific to staffing. So organisations don't just give in a lump sum and use it how you wish. Here is some money. It must go to staffing levels, skills mix, making a ratio mandatory.
So here is what the aged care sector has received in tonight's budget. Additional funding of nearly $18 billion over a 5-year period. 80,000 new home care packages to be rolled out over the coming 2 years. Just over $300 million to increase the capacity of the aged care regulator. 33,000 new training places in aged care. And then from October 2023, this is a big one, staff will be required to provide 200 minutes of care per day for each resident. I want to bring in now Anne Connolly, the ABC investigative journalist whose Four Corners story prompted the Royal Commission, Patricia Sparrow from the Aged and Community Services Australia organisation, and Ian Yates from the Council on the Ageing. Welcome to you all. And let me start with you. One of the key recommendations of the Royal Commission was to fund aged care based on need. Recommendation 25 it was, and it said an entitlement to all forms of support and care which the individual is assessed as needing. Do the changes tonight, Anne, mean we will have funding based on need?
Well, funding based on need has been a policy of the government for decades, so there's nothing new there. I mean, I think that overall this funding package is welcome. Obviously, the sector is suffering, but it's not the generational change and reform that the government is touting. I mean, they're talking about 80,000 home care places. There's already 120,000 waiting on the list already. That 80,000 doesn't come in for 2 years. There's no mandatory training for aged care workers, and there's a real problem because we've got a border which is closed, so the migrant workers who would normally take those lowly paid jobs without training are no longer there. So they're talking about needing a workforce of 1 million workers by 2050, and the training that they've put up today is 33,000 spaces. So it's not the reform that we're talking about. They have rejected the idea that there should be a registered nurse on 24/7. They have rejected the idea that there should only be geriatricians and psychiatrists prescribing antipsychotics. So, and also the transparency about the funding that's going to the sector. That's not there either. So the sector is getting a lot more money, but in terms of it being tied to more staff, that's not obvious at all.
Well, Patricia, let me come to you there. I mean, Anne mentions the extra 80,000 places not meeting the number who are already on the waiting list. But this is over a 2-year period, they're suggesting. Is it appropriate? Is there the workforce to deliver more than that in a shorter period of time?
I think that's why you are seeing it over a 2-year period. I mean, we'd love to be able to do it all tomorrow, but we do need to make sure that we've got workers who are appropriately trained to support people at home. So I think that's why you're seeing the 80,000 over 2 years. But obviously we want to do that as quickly as possible, and if it can be done earlier, we'll all be working really hard to make sure that it is.
Ian, let me bring you in here. This recommendation of the Royal Commission that has been adopted, 200 minutes per resident per day of care, including 40 minutes provided by a registered nurse. As Anne pointed out earlier, there's no adoption of the recommendation of a registered nurse 24/7. But what will that 200 minutes a day mean in practice? And again, is the workforce there to deliver that?
So, David, the workforce is an issue in all areas, in home care and in residential care. But what the 200 minutes, including 40 of nursing, means is a significant uplift across a lot of the sector. There are our best providers who are pretty close to or achieving that, but many are not, and that's really important. I need to be clear, because we've spoken with the government tonight. The other component of that is 16 hours a day of nursing is required, a nurse on duty, and they have not made a decision not to do the rest. They just haven't made the full decision to do it. And David, if I just could say, the 80,000 packages, we have 92,000 on the wait list today. A lot of those are in packages, but the wrong ones. The 80,000 we think will clear the waiting list probably by the end of next year, or certainly by the middle of 23.
And is it, just on that, Ian Yates, is that an appropriate time frame to deal with that home care waiting list?
As Pat said, we would really like to have it all gone tomorrow, but you can't do it if you don't have the staff. And there certainly is an issue with the borders closed, and they're going to have to make working in aged care more attractive. We think the government ought to support the Health Services Union's application to the Fair Work Commission for increased wages. That'll make the jobs more attractive. And having a new home care program by 2023 will help as well. But yeah, workforce is going to be the major challenge.
And let me come back to you. One of the most disturbing aspects in this space, in your reporting, in the Royal Commission as well, has been these cases of neglect and abuse and insufficient care. Yes, these staffing, these resources are aimed at helping, but there are also some oversight steps that have been announced in the government's response to the Royal Commission as well. Is it clear to you that these problems, these awful incidences of abuse and neglect, will be resolved through the changes that have been unveiled?
Well, look, one of the things that the Royal Commission really wanted was transparency. And there is now a serious incident response scheme. So if there's incidents of assaults, residents going missing, terrible neglect, that's to be reported. However, the public's not ever going to know about it because despite the fact that the government has said we're going to have a star rating system, which is wonderful, that there will be more detail for people to try and choose a home, it's not going to record the number of complaints made about the home, the number of serious incidents about it. They will find out some details of how the audits go, but as the Royal Commission showed, the regulator was incredibly ineffective over decades now. I mean, it's very hopeful. The Royal Commission recommended that it be disbanded. Now it's been given a lot of extra funding and extra officers, and you would have to hope that that would change and improve things. But one of the big complaints and findings that they made is that the regulator is very much influenced by the Department of Health, therefore by the government. And so it's one of those situations of the government needs providers to stay in the game, private and not-for-profit. And if you keep it lightly regulated, you can do that. So they're going to have to really, you know, it's a very difficult dual role to take on board.
Patricia, just a quick one finally to you. The overall package of this is, as we can see in the budget, $17.7 billion. That's over 5 years. The Grattan Institute, though, had suggested implementing the Royal Commission recommendations could cost up to $10 billion per year. Has the government shortchanged things tonight?
I think it is a comprehensive reform package, and they've also released, obviously, their response to the Royal Commission report. So if you look at all of those things together, we've got a comprehensive reform plan. And I think one of the important things for people to really understand too is that there's a critical introduction of independent pricing, and the pricing will actually, when that comes in, will actually cost and fund what it costs to deliver quality care to older Australians. So I think that's a really important element that everyone needs to focus on as well.
All right, Patricia Sparrow, Anne Connolly and Ian Yates, thank you all very much for joining us this evening. I want to get some reaction to this aged care overhaul. Jeremy Fernandez is with some of those who will be directly impacted by the changes. Jeremy.
David, I want to introduce you to Paul D'Amico, who is one of those 102,000 recipients on a waiting list for a home care package, and also Dr. Nikki Howard. Nikki runs a group called South Care, which specialises in providing home care packages. You're a non-for-profit as well. Thank you both for joining us. We've generously shouted you a couple of glasses of water here.
Great to be here.
Paul, I want to start with you. You're on a waiting list. You've been assessed as requiring a higher level of care, but you haven't got your place yet. Why is that?
Well, I'll give you a picture of what's happening in my case, and probably other people on the same boat. I was recommended by Silver Chain in February last year that to join, level 3, because I was on level 2. And we put the application, and then after a few months, it was May, they said, okay, you have been approved. At this point, as today, I haven't got it. They told me that this could take about between 18 months, 12 months, or 15 months.
And they're telling you it takes that long because there's just no place for you on level 3.
They said, I think they said about the money or something. I'm not sure, but I know they said there's a waiting list.
Yes.
That you have to wait all this time.
Yes.
And of course now, as per today, I haven't got it yet.
Well, Nikki, the government's trying to shorten that waiting list by providing an extra 80,000 home care packages. How much will that go to mitigating some of these issues that Paul's
Well, look, it certainly will, and we really welcome what the budget has brought down for aged care. But unfortunately, if you're one of those 22,000 people that are on the wait list, because there's 102,000 people on the wait list, the government's saying we'll give an extra 80,000. What about the other 22,000 people who are waiting? What if it was your mum or dad? So it doesn't go far enough.
Paul, explain to me the gap between the care you receive at level 2 that you're getting now and what you're missing out on by not getting the care on level 3.
Well, there's more than a few things that, like, first of all, I need physio as an example because of my conditions, as you know.
So you need help to walk, and the physio
walk as well. The physio helped me a lot.
Yeah.
And another thing we need is, I need a bed, because since I had the operation, those 7 years, I haven't slept. Be honest, I haven't slept all this year. In my bed, I did change the mattress and so on, no sleeping. So I think a medical bed, and this has to come through the
Through the
care.
package.
Yeah.
And there are simple things like cleaning, doing the shopping. Loneliness is an issue for you as well, right?
All that, it's on top of this. I feel not only for myself, but I feel for other people on the pension. And Silver Chain has helped me a lot during this time since I signed in for them. And they provide the services.
Yeah.
But if I want something else, there's no money there. Money's not there.
Nikki, 33 extra training places for the sector.
Yes.
That sounds like a good thing.
Look, it does sound like a good thing, Jeremy, but the question I have is, if we're going to get an extra 80,000 home care packages, we need the staff to deliver those packages. Those training places are for trainees, and when the average worker is only getting $22 an hour, I didn't hear too much in the budget about wages. So I'm curious around, you know, we're getting a lot of money into the sector, but what about the staff? How do we attract and retain staff if we're offering them $22 an hour?
As a side note as well, you're reliant on borders opening because there's a big reliance on overseas workers to fill these places.
Absolutely. Overseas workers, students, you know, often students will take up the places while they're studying. So this is a sector-wide issue. This is a national issue for every aged care provider is having a problem trying to attract and retain staff.
Nikki, Paul, it's so nice to talk to you both. Thank you so much for coming out on a Tuesday night.
Thank you. We are very pleased. Thank you.
All right, Jeremy, thank you very much for that. Nikki and Paul as well. As we've heard, the big goal for the government in tonight's budget is to drive unemployment down. Business big and small is key to doing that. David Chow takes a deep dive into what's in this budget to unlock business investment.
Boosting the level of business investment is a key focus of this year's budget, and the government has thrown in lots of sweeteners. One of the big ticket items is extending the instant asset write-off by an extra year, up to June 2023. Basically, this allows businesses to deduct the full cost of any new assets of any value, like computers, cars and furniture, straight away. To qualify, the annual turnover of your business needs to be less than $5 billion, which is practically every business in Australia. Also getting extended by an extra year, the temporary loss carryback provisions. So those businesses can claim tax losses from the 2023 financial year and offset that against profits they were previously taxed on as far back as 2019. Together, these measures will cost almost $21 billion over the next 4 years. And job creation is another major focus, and the government will extend its job trainer subsidies for 17 to 24-year-olds by an extra 2 years. Treasury says an extra 163,000 people will be able to sign up to low-fee training courses in areas where there are skills shortages. The estimated cost to the federal government is $500 million, with the states and territories expected to match that. On top of that, the government will expand its apprenticeship wage subsidy. Basically, the government will cover half the wages of apprentices or trainees, up to $7,000 per quarter over the next year. Another big ticket item is the government's digital economy strategy, which is expected to cost $1.2 billion. One new feature is that businesses will now be able to self-assess how quickly they can claim tax breaks for intangible assets like patents, designs, copyright and in-house software. And the government has also introduced a so-called patent box to encourage medical and biotech companies to do their research and development here. Companies that earn profits from local patents will see their tax rate slashed from as much as 30% down to 17%. All up, the government is expecting this boost in business investment to create 60,000 new jobs in the next 2 years. But a lot can happen between now and then, especially given the uncertainty of when international borders will reopen.
Well, coming up next hour is a special budget edition of The Business. Kath Robertson joins me now. And Kath, as we just heard, this big spending budget also has plenty of specific measures there for business, and you'll be taking a good look at those tonight.
We will indeed, David. We'll delve exactly into what this budget means for business, specifically looking into some of the incentives, the tax incentives on offer, including the extension of the instant asset write-off, and whether or not that's going to be as impactful, because it is an extension and many of these farmers say have brought their tractors or tradies have brought their utes. We'll look at the extension of the job trainer as well, and we'll also look at the digital transformation and what's involved for the digital economy. I'll be joined by an expert panel of economists on all those issues, Danielle Wood from the Grattan Institute and Andrew Charlton. We'll also be speaking to the Finance Minister, Simon Birmingham, on the bigger picture of this big spending budget.
All right, thanks, Catherine. That's all coming up after 10 p.m. Eastern. Now, we know, as discussed, that some of the hardest hit businesses have actually been in the tourism and hospitality sectors, and news that the international border won't be reopening until well into next year will be a further blow for some. Before we hear from the industry's peak representatives tonight, here are some tourism operators hardest hit by the closure of that international border.
We operate a marine